Good afternoon and welcome to the Linen Hall Library's September events programme. I'm Jason Burke. I'm joining you here from the Governor's Room in the library. Obviously, we're still online. We will be online for the foreseeable future until such times as it's safe to host audiences here in the library building. You'll be pleased to know that we have invested in some camera and microphone equipment in an attempt to try and enhance our broadcasts, but also to improve your all-round experience of our online events. And thanks go to the Arts Council's emergency fund for the money to buy those bits and pieces of equipment. The library is open to the public. We are free to enter, although we are on reduced opening hours at the moment from 10 a.m. until 3 p.m. Now, this month's From the Linen Hall Archives talk is, as ever, by me, but it's inspired by a rare copy of the Belfast Strike Bulletin, which is held here in the library's collections. And the talk will explore the Belfast engineering strike of 1919, an almost totally forgotten episode of Belfast's tempestuous history, which brought the city to a total standstill in an attempt to secure a shorter working week. The Belfast engineering strike should be seen in the context of what was happening globally. There had been revolutions in Russia and in Germany, as well as activity closer to home with various strikes during the First World War. Further back, you may even argue that the Dublin lockout of 1913 and the Belfast strike of 1907 were still fairly recent events in 1919 and would have shaped how workers chose to react in testing circumstances. It's also worth including here that on Saturday, the 30th of November 1918, there was a gathering of trade unionists and labour activists in Belfast's Ulster Hall to pledge support to the Labour candidates in the upcoming general election. It would have been easy for me to pass over this event, actually. However, the Freeman's Journal newspaper described it as, quote, the most remarkable demonstration of trade unionism ever witnessed in Belfast, using the headline, The North Awakening, with echoes there of Owen McNeill and The North Began. Among the Labour candidates were several men who would go on to be leaders of the engineering strike just a few months later. Looking back at it, you'd be forgiven for coming to the conclusion that there was a revolutionary ambience in Labour circles at that time. Perhaps more importantly, though, the Belfast strike should be seen in the context of the end of the Great War, a cataclysmic event that was not only devastating for servicemen and their families on a human level, but also for European economies. Here in Belfast, the war had forced local industries into confrontation with the state at various points, and so the idea of strike action was a path well trodden. Added to economic crisis was the demobilisation of servicemen at the end of the First World War. The city of Belfast had provided some 46,000 volunteers for military service during the First World War, and by 1919, many of these were in the process of returning to Belfast and looking for employment in their old stomping ground. The strike itself was fundamentally about a reduction in the working week. During the war, the working week in Harland and Wolff and Workman and Clark shipyards, for example, was 54 hours before overtime, and it was not uncommon for men to be working 60 and 70-hour weeks in this period. Therefore, the battle was to reduce these hefty working hours to 44 hours, and in doing so, create opportunities for returning servicemen. In that sense, the intentions were entirely admirable. The demand for a reduction in the working week was coupled with the demand that there should be no reduction in pay. Again, this does not appear to have been unreasonable in the context of some others. In Glasgow, for example, the initial intent was to go on strike for a 30-hour week before they eventually did go on strike for a 40-hour week. So what actually happened then during the strike? From July 1918, there was an attempt by the engineering trade unions across the United Kingdom to negotiate the working week down to 44 hours with no reduction in pay. Predictably, though, employers were resistant. On the face of it, a shorter working week appears to have made good sense, given that the end of the war would simultaneously reduce demand for orders and increase demand for employment. However, Following an employer's ballot, the best offer on the table was a 47-hour week, not the 44-hour week that the workers and the trade unions had hoped for. Many workforces in Great Britain voted in favour of the 47-hour proposals. However, Belfast and Glasgow voted against. Consequently, the Federation of Engineering and Shipbuilding Unions for Belfast and Glasgow threatened strike action. On the 5th of December 1918, the campaign for a 44-hour working week was brought to the Ulster Hall for a mass meeting. It was just over a week until the UK general election, and all candidates were invited along to offer their views. On the platform were Sir Edward Carson and 10 other election candidates, though not Joe Devlin, Nationalist MP for West Belfast, who sent apologies as he was suffering from a cold. During the meeting, James Freeland, from the Amalgamated Society of Engineers, proposed that the meeting should collectively call for a 44-hour week to be introduced from the 1st of January 1919. Amongst other speakers, Sir Edward Carson offered his views. They were what could be described as measured considerations, not designed to win friends or to win votes. Carson agreed with the principle of their stand. He began by saying, quote, "For a great part of my professional career, I used to get up at 4:30 in the morning and work very often until late at night. I never liked getting up at 4:30, and at last I came to the conclusion that it was a dog's life, and I gave it up." He went on to say that he had no issues with the 44-hour week being proposed, but that he did have reservations about Irish workers being out of sync with workers in Great Britain and the potential implications for economic competitiveness across the United Kingdom. His preferred option was that Belfast workers should convince Great British workers to stand with them in their campaign for 44 hours. That way, there would be parity. Nevertheless, Freeland's proposal was unanimously accepted at the end of the meeting, and in doing so, they had hastened the possibility of a strike in Belfast. The Federation of Engineering and Shipbuilding Unions met again on the 8th of January 1919 in order to decide how they would proceed. They opted to ballot their membership on the issue of strike action. The ballot was held on Tuesday the 14th of January. At 12 noon, about 30,000 shipyard and engineering workers downed tools and streamed out of places like Harden and Wolff, Workman and Clark, Mckay's and the Sirocco Works. They joined a procession on Queen's Road and were led into the centre of Belfast by a fife and drum band, some bagpipers and the Sirocco Works brass band. Some of the slogans carried by this dungaree-clad army included 44 hours means work for demobilised soldiers, 44 hours means no unemployment, and 47 be hanged, we want 44. One man simply carried a plain iron shovel with the figure 44 inscribed on it. When they reached Belfast City Hall, they took part in a brief open-air meeting where addresses were given by trade unionists. They then marched to their respective union headquarters to vote overwhelmingly in rejection of the offer of 47 hours. They were still insisting on 44 hours. The next day, at a meeting in the Assembly Hall in Belfast, the results of the ballot were read out. Meanwhile, employers were busy scrambling meetings of directors to try and find a resolution. The unions publicly informed them, however, that if the resolution was not a 44-hour working week, then they would cease work on Saturday the 25th of January at 12 noon. The scene was set. When the day arrived with no resolution in place, workers belonging to the Federation of Shipyard Workers, Engineers and Allied Trades left work under a pledge not to return except on the basis of a 44-hour week. Workers were immediately withdrawn from the city's gasworks and power station, while no trams could be seen after 4 p.m. The gas supply was cut off the next morning, and the electricity supply was cut off on the Monday. Hospitals, though, were spared any power disruption. Over 40,000 people were out of work either by choice or by compulsion in the space of just 2 days. Belfast had become an idle city in darkness. The strike committee of 126 members assumed total control of the city during this period, so much so that the strike was being referred to in some quarters as a Soviet. The committee ran the city in conjunction with the Belfast Lord Mayor, while the Royal Irish Constabulary appointed 300 special constables nominated by the strike committee to help maintain law and order and avoid battles with the police. Yards were closed and pickets prevented anyone from going down Queen's Road without a pass from the strike committee. They even stopped company directors. Anyone who wanted a power supply had to apply to the strike committee to be reconnected. However, this did not prevent city centre businesses, including the Belfast Telegraph, trying to tap into emergency power supplies intended for hospitals, resulting in them being stoned by crowds of workers until they closed. Other than this incident, violence had largely been avoided in Belfast, primarily due to the foresight of unionist politicians who saw that it would be counterproductive to risk the intervention of British troops, hence why the strike committee were able to exude such power in the early days of the strike. It was also helped by the strike committee, who arranged regular patrols of the streets to prevent hooliganism, as they termed it. George William Hackett Payne, a former leading member of the Ulster Volunteer Force and an officer of the 36th Ulster Division, was now the Chief Military Officer of British forces in the north of Ireland. Hackett Payne insisted that troops be kept in their barracks. Also, Dawson Bates, the future Home Affairs Minister at Stormont, warned Edward Carson that, quote, "Once one of the workers got injured in a melee with the troops, nothing could save Belfast from becoming a scene of disorder, the consequences of which were far-reaching." The press suffered some short-term problems. Also, the Irish News, for example, was closed down until the 14th of February. The Belfast Telegraph was closed for a week, and the Belfast newsletter missed one single issue. But the Northern Whig did somehow manage to keep going, though reduced in size and in circulation. In order to maintain the flow of news and information, the strike committee published their own newspaper, the Belfast Strike Bulletin, from Artisans Hall in Garfield Street. You can see an original copy of the third issue of this bulletin here at the Linen Hall Library. Other issues were definitely produced during the strike, but I can't say for certain where exactly these other copies might exist. There is one copy at the Public Records Office in Titanic Quarter, but it happens to be the same issue as the copy at the Linen Hall. On closer inspection, it's a curious little publication, only 4 pages long, but laced with fighting talk and high aspiration. To quote from it at length, "Readers will observe our little paper is growing. It was a humble little sheet at first, but it always contained the real stuff. We intend to make it a much bigger thing. We are going to place it amongst the best periodicals published. We hope in time that it will take the place in the workers' hands of those rags which seize every opportunity of misrepresenting the workers, of pouring abuse upon their motives, and of hurling contempt at their efforts, while an attempt is being made to lighten the intolerable burden which labour has had to support in the past. We anticipate in the near future being able to put into the hands of the public a much better paper than any hitherto produced in Belfast, and as a result, we shall have the only paper produced." Is it any wonder, after such hostility from the strike bulletin, that the Belfast Telegraph and Belfast Newsletter, for example, went on to be openly critical of the strike, basically labelling all those involved as Bolsheviks, anarchists, and Sinn Féiners? Elsewhere in the strike bulletin, one could read an update on the outcome of any recent meetings held by the Federation of Engineering and Shipbuilding Unions, very much keeping the men informed. My personal favourite, though, is the section simply called "The Bulletin." At this point, I will let the bulletin speak for itself. Newspapers play a part in the commercial and general life of the communities that cannot be performed in any other manner. Fortunately or unfortunately, the usual news sheets of the city are just now very considerably curtailed. We are supplying this deficiency, and we will print personal notices, lost and finds, wanted, for sale, births and marriages, or anything you like, at rates that are very reasonable. Now, I just love the idea of some shipyard worker from East Belfast posting a marriage notice in the Belfast Strike Bulletin. I mean, maybe it happened, I've only had eyes on this particular issue. So if you're listening to this and you have a few issues of the Belfast Strike Bulletin stashed away, do get in touch, because I and the Linen Hall would be delighted to hear from you. By the second week of the strike, the strikers' resolve was beginning to waver. They hadn't counted on a long drawn out strike that would impact them financially, or that their dramatic actions of the previous week would yield no concessions. As Charles Mckay, one of the leaders of the strike, put it on the 20th of January, quote, "The fight would be bitter, and some of them had got to suffer. It was better to make it fast and furious, short and sharp." So they had hoped then to drive the key local employers, people like William James Peary of Harden and Wolff, to the negotiating table and to win quickly. On Tuesday, the 4th of February, a huge demonstration of strikers made its way from Carlisle Circus to Belfast City Hall. The meeting ended in an extraordinary scene. The funeral cortege of George Cumming, the managing director of Harden and Wolff, passed Belfast City Hall, and members of the strike committee led many of the workers in joining the cortege. By this stage of the strike, there was an attempt by William Peary to negotiate its end, but ultimately it came to nothing. On the 12th of February, the Glasgow strikers surrendered, leaving Belfast isolated. By now, the authorities, the press, and the employers were becoming increasingly frustrated at the situation. The Lord Mayor issued calls for individuals to return to work, and this was followed by a military operation where armed troops moved in to regain control of the gasworks and power stations. The men were told to return to work, and most of them did. The strike was beginning to fall apart, and attention switched to securing a 47-hour week, which they had previously been offered and had rejected. By Tuesday, the 18th of February, the unions were admitting defeat, and the strike committee were advocating an end to the strike and a return to work on the basis of a 47-hour week. By Thursday, the 20th, a vast majority of those involved were back to work with their new working hours, and the strike was over. The strike committee argued the failure of the Belfast workers was due to the collapse of the movement in GB, which had left them isolated. In the final edition of the Belfast Strike Bulletin, they printed, quote, "We feel that if the same spirit had been shown elsewhere as was exhibited in Belfast, the end would have been immediate victory. As it is, the 44 is only delayed." Ultimately, though, the strike had failed to achieve its key demands, but it did prompt something of a red wave of industrial unrest across Ireland and Britain, paving the way for further reductions in the working week. In May 1919, for example, circa 100,000 people reportedly turned out for the Belfast Mayday rally in Ormeau Park, possibly the biggest ever Mayday rally held in Ireland. The first opportunity to cash in some of this momentum was in the council elections of 1920, when the first preference vote for Labour candidates was at its highest in Belfast. Here, they won 13 seats on the Belfast Corporation. Was this a direct consequence of the engineering strike? Well, quite possibly yes, because 5 of the 13 elected were leaders of the 1919 strike. Sam Kyle, for example, topped the poll on the Shankill Road, while in Sandy Row, another strike leader topped the poll, and so on. Yet within a few months, organised trade unionism in the shipyards was smashed, and many members of the strike committee were expelled during an episode of shipyard expulsions when Labour activists and Catholics were systematically punished. Among them were many Protestants labelled rotten prods for their perceived disloyalty. From then until 1922, Belfast became engulfed in some of the worst sectarian fighting that the city has ever witnessed before or since, and with it, the hopes of a strong Labour movement which might have transcended religious and cultural differences were dealt a heavy blow. If you enjoyed this talk, please consider becoming a member of the Linen Hall Library. For the price of a couple of cups of coffee per month, you can be a member of this unique institution with all the benefits that it brings. Please ask at the library's main issue desk for more details on how to become a member of the Linen Hall Library. For our next online event, we will have Michael Boyd from the Irish Football Association speaking as part of our ongoing Northern Ireland Political Collection lecture series. Michael is the Director of Football Development with the IFA and will speak about his previous role where he successfully spearheaded the Football for All campaign for the IFA, of which we have here at the library a few related items in our Northern Ireland Political Collection. Thank you for tuning in, and until next time, stay safe.